Hi. So this is the video lesson for our Writing 1 class today. We're going to be talking about relative clauses. So I want to make clear, again, as I have been lately, that what we're going to talk about today is not a new design for a sentence. It's not a new sentence structure. We only have the 4 ways to build sentences in English. We can create a simple sentence with just one main clause. We can create a compound sentence with more than one main clause joined by conjunctions, or we can design complex sentences with a subordinate clause and a main clause, or the other way around, a main clause and a subordinate clause. The 4th way is a combination of compound and complex. Those are still the only 4 designs for sentences in English, and maybe in other languages, I'm not sure. But within those clauses, within the main clauses, or within the subordinate clauses, there might be some other structures that show up, other things that show up. We've seen a few of them. We've seen, for example, that within a main clause or within a subordinate clause, we could have parallel structure, things in a list. I bought bread, cheese, and milk, things in a list. Or we can have appositives that rename the noun. We talked about that last time. Or we can have simple or compound subjects and predicates. Okay, all of those things, those are not new designs for sentences. Those are things that happen within a clause, within a main clause or within a subordinate clause. Okay, today we're going to talk about relative clauses, which you notice are called clauses. So they don't actually happen inside a main clause or a relative clause. They do interrupt main clauses or subordinate clauses, I meant. We'll see how that works. But they're actually clauses. Let's remember, jot it down if you need to, that a clause is a group of words that has a subject and a predicate. We've talked about this many times. A group of words that has a subject and a predicate. That's what a clause is. Okay, relative clauses are groups of words that begin with a relative pronoun. And in a relative clause, the relative pronoun is the subject and then has a predicate. We'll see what that looks like in just a minute. So, relative clauses begin with a relative pronoun. I listed some common relative pronouns on the handout. The ones we're going to talk the most about are who, which, and that. Who, which, and that. Those are 3 really common relative pronouns, and they are common enough that they're good examples for us to use. All right, now why should we care about relative pronouns? Why should we worry about them? Because there are comma rules that go along with relative pronouns. And luckily, they're the same comma rules that we saw with appositives. And that is that if the relative clause or appositive is essential, if it's necessary, if it's got to be there, we are not going to put commas around it in the sentence. We're not going to cut it off from the rest of the sentence with commas. If the relative clause or the appositive is not essential, if it's not necessary, if it's extra information, then we are going to separate it from the rest of the sentence with commas. So if it's necessary, no commas. If it's extra, yes, commas. All right, let's look at some examples. These are from your handout, but I just made them a little bit bigger so we can see them more easily. Look near the top of your handout, find the sentence that says, "The house that has the great Christmas decorations is mine." The house that was built recently is mine. Okay, the house that was built very recently is very large. The house that was built recently is very large. Okay, here, we got that sentence here. Now, we see that there's a relative pronoun in there, that, right? So you might want to circle that relative pronoun. That relative pronoun is part of a clause that has a group of words with a subject and predicate. What is it that? That what? That was. So that is a subject and was is a predicate. Okay, that was, that is the subject, was is the predicate, and that's a clause. That was built recently. Those words make up a clause. In this case, a relative clause, because it begins with a relative pronoun. And then if you look around it, we have a main clause. Here's the main clause. The house is very large. House is the subject, is the predicate. The house is very large. So that's a main clause. Okay? And look, the relative clause interrupts the main clause. It comes in the middle of the main clause. Okay? That's typical. Not always does it happen, but it's a typical thing that a relative clause does, that it interrupts or comes in the middle of a main clause. Okay, now here's the question. Here's the deal. Relative clauses tell us more about a noun that's in the sentence. Sometimes that noun is the subject, sometimes it's just another noun, okay? So in this sentence, that was built recently tells us about the house. The house, which house? The one that was built recently is very large. Okay? So this whole clause, that was built recently, tells us more about house. So the whole clause modifies or tells us more or describes more about the house. The house. Which house? The house that was built recently. Okay? That's a relative clause. Now, once we know that that's a relative clause, we have to decide whether we're going to put commas around it or not. So the question is it necessary information or is it extra information? So could I just say the house is very large? No, because I don't know which house. The house is very large. Which house? It's the house that was built recently is very large. So that relative clause is necessary. It has to be there. So if it's necessary, no commas around it. Okay? All right, we're going to stop here and come back with an example of the other way it can go. All right.